Again, thank you, Perrin. To introduce our first keynote presenter, Andrew Enns is the Executive Vice President, Winnipeg, with Leger Marketing, a great friend of the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce. Andrew has 20 years' experience in the Canadian market research industry, providing strategic advice for a wide range of public and private sector clients. And currently, he manages the Leger Winnipeg office and participates in the company's national public affairs practice. Prior to his time in the research industry, Andrew spent almost a decade working in the governments of Canada, Ontario, and Manitoba, supporting several cabinet ministers and premiers and providing advice on an array of public affairs topics. And over the course of this past year, Leger conducted weekly polls related to all things pandemic and political. And these results have been fascinating. And Andrew's here today to share a snapshot of some of those insights. Andrew, welcome to the Manitoba Economic Summit. And the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chuck. I hope I'm not the first hiccup of the day here in terms of...
It's all going to go awesome.
I was going to go. So I'm going to share my screen and provide the group here just some data on where public opinion has been so far. Can you is that visible to the group? Perfect. So really, this draws upon data as Chuck mentioned. At Leger, we started polling on the pandemic on the 20th of March of 2020. So literally, 10 days after the World Health Organization announced a global pandemic, and we've kept going at it for up to present. We released our last set of COVID numbers on Monday. So we've got a really interesting sort of perspective on the pandemic from how Canadians have viewed it. And periodically, I'll drop in some references to how Manitobans and folks in the prairies have viewed things as well. The sort of one of the going here. So just to keep going here, in terms of how Canadians have sort of felt throughout this pandemic, this is a question we've been asking from the very early stages in terms of do we feel the worst is worst is ahead of us, the worst of times are ahead of us? Are we in the worst of the crisis at the moment, and or is the worst still yet to come? And the red line is basically the we're in the worst at the moment. The black line is the worst is behind us, and the gray line is that people are still thinking bad times are ahead. Now, a couple of things I've flagged as sort of the wave perspective here. So the first wave, this was brand new, and very clearly there was a lot of feeling that there was really tough times ahead. But what's interesting is how quickly things dissipated in that first wave, and particularly here on the prairies, where literally we were, felt that this very dire thing was coming, and very quickly we got the feeling that maybe it's not so bad. And we got into that summer period, and things were pretty stable. That red line dipped quite low. Things were good in terms of infections. There was news coming out of the U.S. where things weren't as good, and that started to raise that gray line where things might be bad things ahead. And then what you see is that second wave, and that second wave really started, in Canada, it started toward the end of summer. In Manitoba, it was toward the end of September, early October. And it was a prolonged period, and you saw some, the worst of that red line really spike up. And then we saw a nice, short decline, driven largely by the arrival of vaccines and how that changed impressions of Canadians and Manitobans. And then, unfortunately, the arrival of variants came quite quickly on the heels of the vaccines, and we're in our current state where things are fairly dire again, not just in Manitoba, but elsewhere in the country. In terms of another question that we've been asking, how fearful are Canadians with respect to contracting the COVID, the coronavirus? And again, we see what was quite interesting is that very early in the pandemic, in those early weeks, Canadians were quite fearful. It was our highest point in terms of 64% of Canadians saying they were almost 2/3 saying they were afraid of catching the virus. And then you saw that dip down again over those May, June months, and then start to climb But the thing that's interesting here, even though we've had some very interesting sort of, points, in September, Justin Trudeau announced the arrival of the second wave. The reality is that the fear that Canadians have felt toward contracting this virus has actually remained fairly consistent and stable throughout the course of the pandemic. And I think that in part explains some of the challenges that governments have been having in terms of getting continued compliance with some of the social measures and some of the steps they're taking to try to keep it safe. It becomes, it's not that we're any less fear, but we're becoming accustomed to sort of living with this pandemic, and as such, some of our motivation to adopt and adhere to some of the public health orders starts to drift. Another very significant element in this pandemic, and we've heard talk about it, and I dare say I think we'll continue talk about it long after we're all vaccinated, and some of the concerns of the contracting the virus that dissipated is the mental health. Mental health situation is certainly one that's been present. This chart here tracks a question that's often used by health professionals as just a very general benchmark measure for the state of mental health. And the red line tracks the percent of people who are self-assessing their mental health as excellent or very good. It may not look as very dramatic, but the reality is it's 10%, 10 points lower than what it was at the beginning of the pandemic. And I would suggest that is actually a problem when it comes to sort of the state of society. On the prairies, it's actually been consistently a little bit even poorer on the prairies. I think in part, we've had more spikes, ups and downs in terms of infections, and then going back into lockdowns has been hard on people. We also see it really difficult for the 18 to 34, the young adults. Another way to ask this, we asked this question at the beginning of the year in terms of just asking people how they felt personally in terms of their mental health. 40% basically said that they felt worse currently in terms of their mental health, or their mental state, compared to what they felt it was prior to the pandemic. So, and really, it's there's a number of different areas where this pops up in terms of single people, people living alone, young people, women. So I think from a government perspective, I suspect from an employer perspective, mental health will be one of those questions and one of those aspects that I think will be deserving of some attention as we move through the post-pandemic period. I want to speak a little bit about the topic I think is on a lot of our minds. We're hearing great news in terms of vaccinations and the pace of those. So I thought I'd share a little bit of how Canadians are looking at that. In terms of the pace of vaccination, 82% of Canadians, and this is data we collected just a few days ago. 82% of Canadians are saying that they've either been already vaccinated, which is around 30, high 30s to low 40s, in the country, or they intend to get vaccinated. Just for context, 8 months ago when we started asking this question, it was 67% said they intended to get vaccinated. So progress is being made. The efforts of government, the efforts of, I know, businesses is advocating people to get vaccinated in terms of speeding up the ability to get out of lockdown. On the prairies, we're in good shape. We're holding our own in terms of the national average. There's obviously pockets where there's work to do. I mean, the so-called anti-vaxxer crowd has held in Canada. It's held pretty steady at that 8 to 9%, that are just do not trust vaccines and likely will not get the COVID vaccine, but that has not increased. There is a hesitancy issue that I know the governments are grappling with, and the AstraZeneca conversation is sometimes challenging. Just for context sake, in the United States, that anti-vaxxer number hovers over 20% pretty consistently. So certainly they have a bit more of an issue there in the US. What's happening, I've seen some news reports here locally as well as nationally. the question of that proof of vaccine, sometimes called as a vaccine passport or a vaccine certificate. Um, this will be an interesting public. I'd suggest a public policy. It'll be an interesting question, I think, as for some retailers, for people who promote big, large events and concerts. This will be a topic on their mind. Currently, 61% of Canadians agree with the provision of some sort of proof of vaccination, a vaccine passport, called it here. In Manitoba, that support is similar to the national level in terms of in around the high 50s, low 60%. So there is some support. There's also some questions around it, and in terms of, and I think those questions relate to the issue of how it's going to be used. We asked a question of Canadians. Should if the government, if everybody's able to get vaccinated who wants to get vaccinated, and let's assume that by toward the end of summer that will be the case. Certainly, it might even be earlier here in Manitoba. Should private businesses have the right to start to restrict, access to their operations to people who can provide a proof of vaccination? And you see some support for that, 60, in around the 60% mark. It is a little bit lower in terms of on the prairies and in Western Canada. I've circled there on the table below, sort of Alberta and Manitoba, Saskatchewan respondents to our survey are a little more reluctant to accept this. So I do think that this will be a question and a bit of a policy debate for governments in terms of how they approach this. Certainly, if you discuss the notion of proof of vaccination within any context of travel and tourism, you get very high support there'd be very high support for the government of Canada to implement a restriction on people coming into the country to only those who have proof of vaccination. Likewise, if there's interprovincial travel, you will get quite high support for having proof of vaccination to move around the country. So certainly there's going to be pressure on the governments providing some sort of proof of vaccination. It's just a matter of to the extent it's used. My next few slides are really, I think, just some teasers, maybe some ideas, Chuck, in terms of the discussion points as businesses shift to fully reopening and what that and the whole return to work, what that sort of looks like. Recently, a couple of weeks ago, we ran a survey for the Winnipeg Free Press, and we had a few questions in there regarding just some statements how people felt about the lockdown. Like, is there this pent-up demand in terms of a release that's going to happen once we're all fully vaccinated and we can feel confident going into stores and restaurants and those sorts of activities. Certainly, there is that frustration with the lockdowns. This poll was taken as we shifted into our current set of lockdown restrictions, and so certainly at 63% are sick and tired of things, which would be an indication that when things lift, there's going to be some activity. I think you see 4 in 10 Manitobans definitely feel they're going to get back to normal once they're fully vaccinated, but there is going to be some holdback. It's not going to be universal, and people will have to ease into it. And you certainly you do get the sense that there's going to be certain elements of public safety and hesitancy that will hold on for a while until people really start to feel that the vaccines are fully effective and that they can get out and enjoy things. And obviously, we'll keep an eye on sort of the new COVID variant. In terms of sort of how Canadians and generally sort of Manitobans feel about what's been locked down and what could be opened, you certainly see strong support for getting retail business open. You see support for schools staying open, divided support, and one can understand sort of the challenge for government as they made that decision to shift to remote learning here in Manitoba. There's a real desire to keep them open as much as possible. Likewise, restaurants, again, it's a mixed view, but there is a strong element in the population, stronger certainly here in the prairies and in Manitoba to keep those restaurants and operations going. And then it drops off as you get into sort of some other activities that we tested in this survey in terms of sporting events and movie theaters and gyms and things. Although I will say here in the prairies, across the board, there's certainly stronger stronger desire to get these operations, get these entrepreneurs back operating. In terms of another aspect that we've heard lots of talk about, the commercial side, the online retailing. I've heard it in several panels I've been part on that what this has effectively done, it hasn't changed the trajectory to digital and to going online and to going, but it's absolutely fundamentally sped things up by years in terms of the amount of Canadians who are there. This was a poll that we did late throughout the summer. It was a number of waves last year, and basically what we were finding is that 2/3 of Canadians had engaged in a online retail activity for the first time. So basically, a new entrant into the online retail market. And half of that have done more than one, and 82% are basically saying that they're going to keep some aspects of their online retail behaviors that they've developed in the pandemic. They're more than likely going to keep those post-pandemic, regardless of where things settle out to in terms of with the vaccines, etc. So clearly, there's been a fairly significant shift to that online, and it's likely not going to dramatically. It will remain to some form even as we move into that post-pandemic period. Another one that I'm sure many of us who are on this webinar are dealing with is the whole work from home, the teleworking, working remotely. And again, this is some data that we collected toward the end of last year. Basically, no surprise, large number of the workforce are experiencing this work from home for the first time. And again, maybe not that surprising. A strong percentage are very, very satisfied with the experience. They quite like it. And quite frankly, again, for businesses in those situations, it will be a bit of an adjustment and a little bit of a transition in terms of what that post-pandemic work office environment looks like in the future. I know several fairly large companies are looking at those hybrid models of some form of combination, and I suspect that will likely spread as the post-pandemic opportunities increase. Another aspect of the telework, working from home. So there are those that would go back to the office, about 3 in 10, 3 in 10 Canadians. But there's also an equal number that if push comes to shove, and they wanted to maintain some of that work, that teleworking work at home, you will get some pushback, and you may get some people that would seek work elsewhere with a more flexible work environment. And certainly, as I noted earlier, there's people have adjusted to the work at home. I'll finish off. I'm almost done here, Chuck. I know I'm not sure where I'm at in my time. The pandemic has been tough on governments, and particularly provincial governments. Certainly, in that first wave in the early months, it was quite positive. I think there was a certain governments were rallying. I think they were being seen as taking action in some unprecedented times. But as we've shifted, and particularly as we got into that second wave, and we had to sort of fall back into some of the lockdowns that we had managed to lift over the summer, as we started to see those infection rates go up, we started to see still deaths in long-term care homes and things like that. There was frustration that governments didn't learn from the first time, and that those challenges took a toll on government satisfaction among the public, and it's still been tough. If you look, the provincial government started off overall at 79% total satisfied across the country, and they're sitting currently at 52%. Likewise, the federal government's had a hard time. It's been long. I think in part you can blame some of this on government action. On some of it, it is just public frustration is manifesting in lower marks. Manitoba is no different. Its ratings at 70% plus up until the early part of September, but that second wave has been very challenging, and they've struggled to sort of get to get ahead of it with respect to public opinion. We had a couple, again, this goes back to a survey that I ran a few weeks ago. I thought this was good for this particular gathering. We asked what the Manitoba government should focus on in terms of the post-pandemic period, and we had offered a list of different options, including supporting small business, growing the economy, investing in long-term care and healthcare, and paying down the deficit. And I was actually surprised, and pleasantly surprised, I'd say, that the support for small business sectors, or restaurant and hospitality, surfaced as the most often selected priority for government action in the coming, in that post-pandemic period to get our economy going. And that is a really good indication of how Manitobans appreciate the need of a vibrant, growing small business community in this province. And just the last slide in terms of how Canadians feel about the road ahead. I'd say it's mixed. I think people want to be optimistic. I think people are feeling better about vaccines and vaccinations. But I also think there's a certain element of Canadians who feel, we felt good before. We thought the light at the end of the tunnel was closer and brighter, and then variants showed up. And so there's hopefulness with the vaccine. I think you see that, and there's hopefulness for the road ahead. But I think there's a little bit of, I would say, cautious optimism. In Manitoba, we've got, in the prairies, we've got probably a little bit more work to do in terms of, getting things going. But, hopefully, vaccination rates continue and things move forward. Chuck, that brings my comments to an end, and I appreciate your time. And if you have any questions, happy to stick around for that.
Andrew, thanks as always for the great information that you've shared with us today, and it's been great to partner with you over the course of this past year as we've done a number of surveys with Leger. I wonder if we can we've got a couple minutes, so we'll just kind of touch upon, maybe if just kind of talk about, there seems to be an increased frustration in Manitoba as compared to other jurisdictions in Canada when you look at your numbers, even in regards to kind of what we've gone through, but as well as in recovery. Is that something that we've seen that trend? That continued frustration among the prairie provinces has increased as this has continued to go on?
I think where you see that number in that sort of that dissatisfaction number and some of those government approval type numbers that are talked about, is that what you have in the prairies, unlike other parts of Canada, we all have our citizens who are worried about the pandemic and feel governments should be doing more about closing things down, should be doing more quicker, should be more aggressive on the healthcare side. But what we have on the prairies in Alberta that's not as common anywhere else is we also have a quite a detectable segment of the population that is actually equally opposed to those lockdowns and equally opposed to the increase. And in part, it's our rural dominance, where like there's parts of rural Canada that literally are, anybody got COVID in town today? No, okay, and that's the challenge.
Yeah, and we see that in the chamber network, for example, just because we've got chambers in, and specifically in northern Manitoba, we'll have very limited cases that are, the fact that we're in code red again and businesses and restaurants are closed down are challenged with that. And I think that shows up in the numbers as well when you ask the question just in regards to, people keeping schools open and retail open. In Manitoba, as compared to other jurisdictions, it's almost like a 50-50 split.
Yeah. Well, and to some degree, I think maybe the government, made the right move with respect to focusing on Winnipeg and Brandon, and not so much on the other schools. That maybe they saw that. I think they saw that in those numbers, and they may tap in slightly to the public sentiment on that.
Andrew, you've been kind of looking at numbers and doing annual reports on a weekly basis over the course of this past, basically 15 months since this started. Is there anything that really jumps out at you in terms of what you've seen over the course of that time, and any kind of real trends that you see as, well, this is going to be a problem continuing to move forward, or there is some level of optimism moving forward?
Well, I think that the trend that, and I mentioned it briefly, the consistency of that of some of those, the fearfulness of the pandemic and the response to the pandemic. I think the longer that went on, the tougher it became for governments to get the buy-in necessary to really, ratchet down those infection numbers. We were running questions, earlier on in late last year, early this year on Canadians, following and adhering the core social, public health measures. And we were finding consistently that anywhere between 30 and 40% of Canadians were not adhering to at least one of some of those core critical messages. And I think to be honest, the vaccines can't come soon enough, because I think the patience of Manitobans, of Canadians, to keep doing this much longer, it would really be taxed. Would really be taxed.
I would agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that's the one thing that we as the Chamber Network have been really pushing for, is the urgency needed around the vaccination to be able to provide people with a real sense kind of moving forward. Andrew, thanks as always. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning for this special event. Excellent presentation as always on the pandemic in the past year, and we've just an incredible array of controversial issues that you've been able to provide great information on in regards to vaccination, masking, the effectiveness of lockdowns, government action as well. Huge thank you to Leger for capturing some real solid data over the course of the past 15 months. If you're interested in seeing a report of any of the survey results, they're available on the Leger website at leger360.com. Thanks, Andrew, for joining us today, and have a terrific day.
You bet. Thanks, Chuck. Good luck with your day.